It started when Mom left. She told me and my little brother Jamie that she needed a break and would be back in a few weeks. Dad didn't say much. He just stared at the floor and muttered something about her needing space. She packed a bag, kissed us on the forehead, and left. 2 days later, she came back. At least, that's what we thought. She looked the same, sounded the same, even smelled the same, lavender and peppermint. But something was off. Her hugs felt empty. Her smile was too wide, too bright, like she was trying too hard. Jamie noticed it first. "Mom's eyes are different," he whispered to me one night as we lay in our bunk beds. "They don't look like hers." I dismissed him at first, telling him he was imagining things. But as the days went on, I couldn't ignore it. Mom's eyes weren't just different, they were wrong. The warm hazel hue was gone, replaced by an unsettling shade of green that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. She started doing things Mom would never do. She'd sit at the kitchen table staring at the wall for hours, her fingers drumming an erratic rhythm. She'd hum songs we didn't recognize. One night I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hall. Peeking through the crack in my door, I saw her walking down the hallway, her movements jerky, like a puppet on strings. She stopped in front of the mirror by the stairs and stared at her reflection. Then she smiled, a wide, toothy grin that stretched too far, her lips cracking at the corners. I bit my lip to keep from screaming and crawled back into bed. The next morning, she acted like nothing had happened. Pancakes for breakfast, a kiss on the forehead before school, a cheerful, "Have a great day." But I couldn't shake the image of her smile from my mind. Jamie and I started keeping track of the strange things she did. The way she always locked the basement door and kept the key around her neck. The way she'd whisper to herself when she thought no one was listening. The way the neighborhood cats seemed to avoid our house now, their eyes glowing in the streetlights as they hissed at her shadow. One night, Jamie woke me up, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. "I saw her in the basement," he said, his voice shaking. "She was talking to someone, or something." He led me to the basement door, and we pressed our ears against the wood. Faint whispers drifted through. Words we couldn't understand. Then a guttural growl that made my blood run cold. We bolted back to our room, too scared to confront her. The next day, Jamie didn't come home from school. I told Dad about Jamie, but he just waved me off, saying he'd probably gone to a friend's house. But I knew better. That night, I waited until she went to bed and took the spare key from the kitchen drawer. With trembling hands, I unlocked the basement door and crept down the stairs. The smell hit me first, a nauseating mix of decay and something metallic. The basement was dark, but a faint green glow illuminated the far corner. There, in the center of a circle of symbols drawn in chalk, was Mom, or whatever she was now. Her back was to me, her head tilted at an unnatural angle as she whispered to something in the shadows. I strained to see, but the darkness seemed alive, writhing and pulsing as if it were breathing. "Mom?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. She froze. Slowly, she turned to face me, her eyes glowing that unnatural green. Her mouth twisted into that too wide smile, and she stepped forward. "You shouldn't be here, darling," she said, her voice layered with something deeper, something inhuman. Behind her, the shadows began to take shape. Tall, spindly figures with elongated limbs and glowing eyes. They moved closer, their forms flickering like a bad signal on an old TV. I bolted up the stairs, slamming the door behind me. I locked it and shoved a chair under the handle for good measure. She didn't follow, but I could hear her laughter, low and guttural, echoing through the house. The next morning, she was gone. Her room was empty, the bed neatly made. Dad acted like nothing had happened, but I could see it in his eyes. He knew. He just didn't want to admit it. A week later, Jamie came back. He walked into the house like nothing had happened, his backpack slung over one shoulder. But he wasn't the same. His eyes, they glowed green. The unsettling presence that had taken our mother had now taken my brother. I knew I had to find a way to stop it. I started researching everything I could about possession and supernatural entities. I found old books in the library, dusty and forgotten, filled with rituals and symbols. I spent nights poring over them, trying to find a way to save Jamie. The more I read, the more I realized how dangerous this entity was. It fed on fear and despair, growing stronger with each passing day. I had to act quickly before it was too late. I gathered the materials I needed, salt, candles, and a piece of Jamie's clothing. I drew the symbols I had seen in the basement, creating a protective circle in the living room. I waited until Jamie was asleep, then carefully placed him in the center of the circle. I lit the candles and began the ritual, chanting the words I had memorized. The air grew thick and the room seemed to vibrate with an unseen energy. Jamie woke up, his eyes wide with fear. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Trust me," I said, continuing the chant. The green glow in his eyes intensified and he began to thrash, trying to break free from the circle. I held my ground, repeating the words over and over. The shadows in the room grew darker, and I could feel the entity's anger. It was fighting back, but I couldn't stop now. The candles flickered and the room grew colder. I could see my breath in the air. Jamie's thrashing became more violent, and I feared the circle wouldn't hold. But then the green glow in his eyes began to fade. The entity's grip on him was weakening. I chanted louder, pouring all my will into the words. Finally, with a final ear-piercing scream, the entity was expelled. Jamie collapsed, and the room fell silent. I rushed to Jamie's side, checking to make sure he was okay. His eyes were back to their normal color, and he looked at me with confusion. "What happened?" he asked weakly. "It's over," I said, hugging him tightly. But I knew it wasn't truly over. The entity was still out there, and it would come back. I had to be ready. I had to protect my family from whatever came next. I spent the next few days reinforcing the house with protective symbols and wards. I didn't tell Dad what had happened. He wouldn't believe me anyway. But I could see the relief in his eyes when Jamie returned to his normal self. I kept the books hidden, ready to use them again if needed. I knew this wasn't the end. The entity would return, and I had to be prepared for the next battle. Weeks passed, and life seemed to return to normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I'd catch glimpses of shadows moving in the corners of my vision, and the air would grow cold without warning. I knew the entity was still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike. I had to stay vigilant to protect my family from the darkness that lurked just beyond the light. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a faint whisper. It was the same guttural growl I had heard in the basement. My heart raced, and I knew the entity was back. I grabbed the books and the materials I had prepared, ready to face it again. This time I wouldn't be alone. Jamie stood by my side, his eyes filled with determination. Together we would fight the darkness and reclaim our home. We drew the protective circle in the living room once more, lighting the candles and chanting the words. The air grew thick and the shadows began to move. The entity appeared, its eyes glowing green, its form shifting and writhing. But we stood our ground, our voices strong and unwavering. The entity roared, but we didn't falter. We knew we had to be strong to protect our family and our home. The battle was fierce, but we didn't give up. We chanted louder, our voices echoing through the house. The entity's form began to waver, its power weakening. With one final desperate scream, it was expelled from our home. The room fell silent, and we knew we had won. But we also knew this wasn't the end. The entity would return, and we had to be ready. We had to protect our family from the darkness.